The morning of October 25th, 1944 arrived over the Philippines, sealed away most mornings do in that part of the world. Humid, still, and thick with the kind of heat that settles into a man's uniform before he's even finished his first cup of coffee. The sky to the east was barely bleeding pink when the radar operator aboard USS Johnston reported the contacts. Not one, not five, not a manageable number of enemy ships that a destroyer could dance around and perhaps survive. 23 warships, moving south through the San Bernardino Strait at flank speed, and at the head of that column, displacing 72,000 tons of armored steel, carrying 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling a shell weighing over 3,200 pounds to a distance of 26 miles, was the Yamato, the largest, most heavily armed battleship ever constructed by any nation in the history of naval warfare. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston and looked at those radar returns for exactly as long as it took to understand what they meant. Then he turned to his crew and said something that no regulation required him to say, something that no order from Fleet Command had instructed, something that came entirely from the character of the man himself. He told them they were going in. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ernest Edwin Evans was born on August 13, 1908, in Pawnee, Oklahoma. His father was part Cherokee, his mother part Creek. He grew up on the edge of poverty in a territory that had only been a state for a single year before his birth, in a community where the difference between getting by and going under was often a matter of stubborn, daily determination. Those who knew him as a child described a boy who did not accept being told he could not do something. When the nearest path was blocked, he found another. When the expected answer was no, he asked a different question. He was admitted to the United States Naval Academy in 1927 and graduated in 1931. When a small number of Native Americans to pass through Annapolis during that era, he was not the tallest man in his class. He was not considered the most polished officer. But the instructors who wrote evaluation reports on young midshipman Evans consistently noted the same quality, year after year, an almost unsettling willingness to close with the enemy. By October 1944, Evans had already compiled a combat record that most officers twice his age would have envied. He had served in the Pacific Theater since the earliest months of American involvement in the war. He had commanded smaller vessels in engagements throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. He had watched destroyers burn at Guadalcanal. He had read the action reports from Cape Esperance, from Tasvaranga, from every engagement where American surface combatants had traded fire with Japanese warships in the narrow, treacherous waters of the South Pacific. He understood the mathematics of naval combat, as well as any man in the fleet. He understood them, and he had decided that mathematics were not the final word on what a ship and crew could accomplish. Johnson herself was a Fletcher-class destroyer, commissioned in October of 1943. She displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded, carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and a crew of 327 men. She was fast, capable of 35 knots in ideal conditions, and she was well armed for a destroyer. But she was a destroyer. She was not a cruiser. She was not a battleship. She had been designed to screen aircraft carriers from submarines and aircraft, to conduct torpedo attacks against surface ships under favorable conditions, and to operate as part of a coordinated fleet formation. She had not been designed to engage battleships. No destroyer had. No destroyer could. The physics of the situation were as straightforward as they were brutal. Johnston's 5-inch shells could not penetrate the main belt armor of any Japanese battleship in Kurita's center force. Yamato's side armor was 16.5 inches of cemented steel plate over a teak backing. Johnston's best armor-piercing rounds, fire at point-blank range, would not go through it. They would mark it, chip it, scratch it at best. Meanwhile, a single 8-inch shell from any one of the Japanese heavy cruisers in that formation would pass entirely through Johnston's hull plating, which measured approximately a quarter of an inch at most, as though it were wet paper. A 14-inch shell from any of Kurita's 4 battleships would not merely penetrate Johnston. It would dismember her. The Japanese fleet bearing down on Taffy 3 that morning was not simply stronger than the American ships in its path. It was categorically different in kind. The center force had assembled at Brunei Bay in Borneo 4 days earlier on October 20th. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had organized it around his most powerful units, Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, 6 heavy cruisers of the Tone and Takao classes, 2 light cruisers, and 11 fleet destroyers. This was the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful operational surface force in 1944, assembled for a single purpose: to reach Leyte Gulf, where General Douglas MacArthur's invasion force was landing, and to destroy the American transports and supply vessels supporting the largest amphibious operation in Pacific history. The plan was called Shogo, Operation Victory. It was, in the estimate of its architects, a suicide mission dressed in the language of decisive battle. Admiral Somo Toyota understood that the Japanese combined fleet could not survive the engagement he was ordering. He ordered it anyway, because the alternative, allowing the Americans to establish themselves on Leyte without opposition, meant the end of Japan's ability to defend her home islands. The oil fields of Borneo and the refineries of the Netherlands East Indies were connected to Japan by sea lanes that ran directly through the Philippines. If MacArthur held Leyte, those lanes were severed. Japan's warships, her aircraft, her factories, all of them ran on oil she could no longer reach. Toyota wrote in his operational orders that it was necessary to make the sacrifice of the entire fleet in exchange for dealing a mortal blow to the enemy. He knew he was sending his best ships to their deaths. He sent them anyway. What Kurita did not know, as the center force emerged from the San Bernardino Strait in the pre-dawn darkness of October 25th, was that the American plan to stop him had already collapsed. Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet and its powerful carrier task forces, had taken the bait that Japanese planners had deliberately laid for him: a decoy force of empty Japanese carriers, stripped of aircraft, stripped of experienced aviators who were dead or grounded, little more than steel hulks sailing in formation, had been positioned to the north of Luzon specifically to draw Halsey away. It worked. Halsey took his fleet carriers north to hunt the decoys, and in doing so he left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. The covering force that was supposed to be blocking Kurita's path to Leyte Gulf was 300 miles away chasing empty ships. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from his flagship Fanshawe Bay, learned about Kurita's center force the same way Evans did, from his own lookouts, who reported colored shell splashes falling near the escort carriers at approximately 6:58 in the morning. The color dye in the shells was a Japanese gunnery technique. Each ship used a different color, so that observers could identify which vessel's rounds were falling where and correct accordingly. Red splashes, green splashes, yellow, purple, the colors of a slaughter, advancing at 25 knots. Sprague immediately turned his carriers southeast, into the wind to launch aircraft, and ordered his escorts to make smoke. 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitcom Bay, and Gambier Bay, turned and ran. Their maximum speed was 18 knots. Yamato could make 31. The carriers were going to be run down in minutes unless something stood between them and the pursuing fleet. Sprague's destroyers and destroyer escorts were all he had. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and 4 John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts, Samuel B., Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond. Combined displacement of the 7 escorts, approximately 15,000 tons. Combined displacement of the 23 Japanese warships bearing down on them, well over 200,000 tons. At 8:55 in the morning, Rear Admiral Sprague gave the order that sent small ships to charge battleships. His exact words, transmitted over the tactical frequency, were, "All ships in company, small boys to tack." Ernest Evans did not wait for Sprague's order. He had already given his own. At approximately 7:10, before the official command to attack had been transmitted, before any other American ship in Taffy 3 had turned toward the Japanese fleet, Johnson had already increased the flank speed and swung her bow toward the enemy. Evans had made the decision unilaterally, without orders, without permission, and without any reasonable expectation of surviving what he was about to do. He keyed the ship's announcing system and spoke to every man aboard. He told them they were going to fight. He told them that Johnston was now a man of war. He told them, using the plain, unadorned language that characterized everything he said, that he intended to go in and give them all he had, and that he expected every man to do his duty. Then he rang up flank speed and headed directly for the largest warships in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Johnston's 5-inch guns opened fire at 15,000 yards, well beyond the effective range at which her shells could do serious damage to armored warships. Evans wanted the Japanese fire control operators tracking him rather than tracking the carriers. If their guns were trying to find a solution on Johnston's small, fast hull, they were not finding a solution on the 6 slow, thin-hulled, unarmored carriers running southeast. Every Japanese salvo that fell near Johnston was a salvo that did not fall near Gambier Bay or White Plains. The exchange rate was brutally simple, and Evans had calculated with the cold accuracy of a man who has accepted what is coming. Johnston's 327 lives of thousands of men aboard the carriers and the tens of thousands of soldiers ashore who would die if Kurita reached Leyte Gulf unchallenged. The Japanese heavy cruisers returned fire almost immediately. The cruiser Kumano, leading the starboard column, had her 8-inch guns trained on Johnston within minutes of Evans' first salvo. The colored shell splashes walked toward Johnston with methodical precision, each salvo adjusted from the last. Evans drove his ship through evasive maneuvers, turning into each salvo to complicate the Japanese range calculations, using the smoke that his crew was generating from the ship's smoke generators and from burning fuel oil deliberately fed into the boilers to produce a black chemical fog across the water's surface. Through the smoke, Johnston ran. Through the smoke and the falling shells and the rising columns of water, she drove toward the Japanese fleet at 33 knots. The torpedo run was Evans' primary objective in the first phase of the engagement. Johnston carried 10 Mark 15 torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts, 5 tubes on each side of the ship. The Mark 15 was a reliable weapon, 21 inches in diameter, running at 46 knots for 6,000 yards on high-speed setting, carrying a warhead of 825 pounds of Torpex explosive. A single hit from a Mark 15 on a warship's hull below the waterline could flood an engine room, rupture a magazine, break a keel. It would not sink a battleship on its own, but it would hurt one, slow one, force one to maneuver, divert its attention. And a torpedo hit on a cruiser was a different calculation altogether. 8-inch cruiser hull plating, however much thicker than Johnston's own, was not designed to absorb underwater explosions of that magnitude. A torpedo hit in the right place would put a cruiser on the bottom. Evans needed to reach torpedo range. Torpedo range meant 4,000 yards, perhaps 5,000 if he was willing to accept a lower probability of hits. 5,000 yards was less than 3 miles. Johnston was charging from approximately 15 miles away. To cover that distance, she had to remain functional, engines turning, hull intact, crew alive, while absorbing whatever the Japanese could throw at her during the approach. The probability of making that run without being hit was, by any objective analysis, low. Evans understood this. He made the run anyway. For approximately the first 40 minutes of the engagement, Johnston's luck held. The Japanese shells fell close, waterspouts climbing 40 and 50 feet above the surface, close enough to shower Johnston's deck with seawater. But they fell short or long or across, the Japanese fire control officer struggling to track a small, fast-moving target partially obscured by smoke. Johnston's own guns kept firing throughout the approach. Her forward 5-inch mounts found the range on the heavy cruiser Kumano and scored multiple hits, setting fires in the cruiser's forward superstructure and temporarily disrupting her gunnery. The hits did not slow Kumano or cause serious structural damage, but they added to the general chaos of the engagement and forced Kumano's crew to deal with fires while simultaneously trying to track and engage Johnston. At approximately 7:50, Johnston reached torpedo range. Evans ordered her port torpedo mount to fire. 5 Mark 15 torpedoes entered the water at intervals of a few seconds apart, their propellers spinning up to speed, running toward the heavy cruiser Kumano at 46 knots. Evans immediately turned Johnston hard to starboard, generating additional smoke, and reversing course open to range and reload the starboard tubes. He never got the chance. At 7:52, within 2 minutes of firing the torpedoes, 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck Johnston in rapid succession. The first shell hit the bridge area, killing or wounding several men and causing severe damage to Johnston's navigation systems. The second penetrated the engine room, destroying one of the two boiler rooms and cutting Johnston's speed by nearly half. The third hit amidships, rupturing fuel lines and causing fires throughout the central section of the ship. Two of Evans' fingers were blown off by shell fragments. His shirt was torn from his body by the concussion. He was bleeding from wounds across his face and hands. He remained on the bridge. The torpedoes he had launched were still running. One of them, possibly two, struck Kumano's bow. The explosion was visible from miles away, a column of orange fire and gray smoke rising 200 feet above the cruiser's foredeck, followed by the secondary detonation of the cruiser's forward magazine. Kumano's bow was blown completely off. The cruiser slewed to a stop, dead in the water, her entire forward section a burning ruin. She would take no further part in the battle off Samar. Another torpedo, tracking slightly off course, struck the light cruiser Suzuya, which had maneuvered to avoid the attack on Kumano and crossed the torpedo's running track at the wrong moment. Suzuya took severe damage and would later be abandoned and sunk by her crew when aircraft attacks opened additional flooding. Two Japanese warships, one of them a heavy cruiser with 10 8-inch guns, were moved from the pursuit of Taffy 3's carriers, in exchange for Johnston's torpedo run. Evans had no time to assess the results. His ship was on fire, running on one boiler room, making 17 knots instead of 33, and the entire Japanese fleet was still behind him. The next 30 minutes were what naval historians would later describe, in the careful language of official analysis, as an extraordinary example of aggressive small ship tactics under overwhelming opposition. In the language of the men who survived it, it was something closer to a controlled descent into chaos, held together by the will of one man and the training of 300 men who had decided to follow him wherever he went. Evans brought Johnston back into the smoke screen and used what remained of his speed to maneuver within the covering cloud. His engineering officers were working to restore power to the damaged boiler room, shoring up ruptured steam lines and bypassing damaged systems. They managed to restore partial power to a second boiler, not enough to return Johnston to full speed, but enough to hold 25 knots in short bursts. Evans used those bursts to move Johnston back and forth along the edge of the smoke screen, emerging periodically to fire her 5-inch guns at any Japanese ship that came within range, then retreating back into the smoke before the return fire could find her. He was also, in these minutes, doing something that the official after-action reports describe only in dry, tactical language, but which any sailor present would have recognized for what it was. He was buying time. Every minute that Johnston remained between the Japanese fleet and the carriers was a minute in which the carriers could open additional distance. Every minute was a minute in which the escort carrier pilots could rearm and relaunch. Every minute was a minute in which rescue might arrive, though Evans had no real expectation that it would. Halsey was 300 miles north. The nearest heavy surface units of 7th Fleet were in Surigao Strait, 150 miles south, having spent the night destroying Kurita's southern force in a different battle entirely. There was no relief coming. There was no cavalry over the hill. There was only Johnston, Hull, Heermann, and the 4 destroyer escorts, and the smoke and the shells, and the determination of men who had decided that this was where they stood. Rear Admiral Sprague's official order, small boys to attack, reached Johnston at approximately 8:55, by which point Evans had already been fighting for nearly 2 hours. The other destroyers and destroyer escorts turned toward the Japanese fleet in response to command. Hull charged the battleship column. Heermann drove toward Yamato herself, forcing the great battleship to turn away and temporarily removing her main battery from the pursuit. The 4 destroyer escorts, Roberts, Dennis, Butler, and Raymond, made their own torpedo runs against the cruiser column, their smaller hulls and lighter weapons no less committed for disparity in firepower. What Kurita's staff was watching from the bridge of Yamato defied the tactical logic that Japanese naval doctrine had been built upon. Fleet destroyers charging battleships was not unknown. It was, in fact, a tactic the Japanese themselves had practiced and respected. But the scale and persistence of what they were seeing was outside the parameters of what they had planned for. Ship after ship emerging from the smoke screen at high speed, each one firing everything it carried, each one absorbing punishment that should have stopped it and continuing to advance. Johnston took a second round of heavy hits. 5-inch shells this time from a Japanese destroyer, then 8-inch rounds from a cruiser, and kept firing. Hull took a 14-inch shell through her engine room and kept firing until both her engine rooms were destroyed and she was dead in the water. Heermann took near misses from Yamato's 18-inch guns, the waterspouts climbing so high they blocked the sun and kept closing. The smoke screen itself had become a tactical environment of extraordinary complexity. Visibility inside the chemical fog dropped to less than 50 yards in places. Ships navigated by sound as much as by sight, the roar of engines, the crack of guns, the crash of shells hitting water. Japanese cruisers penetrated the smoke screen searching for the carriers and found themselves in close-range gunfights with American destroyers they had not expected to be there. At one point, 3 Japanese cruisers and 2 American destroyers were maneuvering within 2,000 yards of each other in near-zero visibility, all of them firing, none of them entirely certain where the other ships were. This was not the orderly long-range gun duel that Kurita's battle plan had envisioned. It was a melee, close, confused, violent, and deeply disorienting to a Japanese fleet that had expected pursuit, not a brawl. Evans drove Johnston through this chaos with a navigator's precision and a fighter's instinct. He used the smoke to approach, the speed, what was left of it, to close, and his 5-inch guns to engage any Japanese ship that appeared through the murk. He was directing fire at cruisers, at destroyers, at whatever emerged from the smoke within range. Johnston's gun crews had been firing almost continuously since 7:10 in the morning. The barrels of her 5-inch mounts were hot enough that the paint was blistering. The ammunition hoists were struggling to keep pace with the rate of fire. The men loading the guns were working on a physical endurance they had not known they possessed, because the situation left no room for any other option. Then came the moment that those who survived Johnston would describe for the rest of their lives with a particular clarity that extreme danger tends to produce in human memory. At approximately 8:55, the same moment Sprague's attack order was being transmitted, Johnston emerged from a gap in the smoke screen and found herself directly between the escort carriers and a column of Japanese heavy cruisers that had broken through the outer perimeter. The cruisers were firing at the carriers. Their shells were finding the range. Gambier Bay, the rearmost of the escort carriers, was already being bracketed. She had no armor, no speed advantage, no ability to defend herself. If the cruisers maintained their firing solutions, she would be sunk within minutes. Evans did not hesitate. He turned Johnston directly toward the cruiser column and ordered flank speed. His ship was making 23 knots on her damaged propulsion plant, down from her maximum of 35, damaged and bleeding from the hits she had already absorbed, but still moving, still fighting. He closed within 7,500 yards of the lead Japanese cruiser and opened fire with all 5 of his 5-inch guns simultaneously. At that range, Johnston's shells were striking the cruiser's superstructure with enough energy to destroy fire control equipment, kill exposed personnel, and set secondary fires. They could not penetrate the main armor belt. They could, and did, force the cruiser's gunnery officers to shift their attention from the distant, slow-moving carriers to the immediate, close-range, and extremely aggressive destroyer that was shooting at them from close range. For approximately 40 minutes in this final phase of the engagement, Johnston fought the Japanese cruiser column more or less alone, maneuvering between the cruisers and the carriers, firing continuously, absorbing hit after hit, and refusing to stop. She was hit by 5-inch shells from Japanese destroyers. She was hit by 8-inch shells from cruisers. She took near misses from the battleships that raised walls of water high enough to wash men off her exposed gun mounts. Each hit reduced her capabilities. Gun mounts were disabled, radar was destroyed, fire control systems failed and were replaced by manual aiming. Damage control parties fought fires in compartments that were simultaneously flooding. Evans commanded through all of it from a bridge that was increasingly exposed to the weather as blast damage stripped away its protection. The crew matched him. Gunner's Mate First Class Robert Billy commanded Johnston's No. 3 5-inch mount through the entire engagement, keeping his gun firing long after the automated loading system failed, and his crew had shifted to manual operation. Torpedo Man First Class Rudy Scow worked to reload Johnston's port torpedo tubes despite the ship taking active fire during the process, completing the reload under conditions that the torpedo handling manual had never considered as a realistic scenario. The engineering staff below decks kept the damaged boilers running at pressures they were not designed to sustain, producing the speed that kept Johnston in the fight and kept her out of the Japanese fire control solutions long enough to matter. At approximately 9:30, the character of the engagement changed. Johnston had by this point been in continuous combat for well over 2 hours. She had fired more ammunition than most destroyer commanders of the era would have believed possible to expend in a single engagement. She had absorbed multiple heavy-caliber hits and was operating at substantially reduced capacity on virtually every system. Her speed was down to 17 knots. 2 of her 5.5-inch gun mounts were out of action. She had no remaining torpedoes. Her radar was gone. Her bridge communications were damaged. Evans himself had been wounded multiple times and was directing the battle partly through voice tubes and partly through sheer physical presence, moving to different parts of the ship to assess damage and issue orders when the communication systems failed. What brought Johnston to her end was not a single catastrophic blow. It was accumulation. A salvo of 8-inch shells from the cruiser Tone struck Johnston along her waterline at 9:35, opening flooding in her forward engineering spaces that the damage control parties could not control. 5 minutes later, a second salvo from a different cruiser, possibly Chikuma, which had been heavily damaged by Robert's gunfire but remained in action, struck Johnston amidships, destroying her second engine room and reducing her speed to 7 knots. She was, at this point, functionally dead in the water. A ship making 7 knots cannot maneuver. A ship that cannot maneuver cannot survive in a gun battle against ships making 25. The Japanese closed in. Multiple ships from the cruiser column concentrated their fire on the stationary target. Shells struck Johnston from bow to stern. Her number 1 gun mount was destroyed. Her number 2 mount was destroyed. Her superstructure was being demolished section by section. Men were dying at their posts. The flooding was beyond control, not because the damage control parties had stopped trying, but because the volume of water entering the ship through the shell holes in her hull exceeded what any pump could handle. Evans was found at approximately 9:40 in the pilot house, attempting to direct the few remaining functional systems. He had been wounded so many times by this point that survivors who saw him in those final minutes could not later say with certainty how many separate wounds he had sustained. He was described as gray-faced, still standing, still issuing orders in a voice that witnesses said remained calm even as the ship was dying beneath him. At 9:45, Johnston's list reached 30 degrees to port. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The crew began going over the side. Johnston continued to take fire from Japanese ships. Some witnesses reported seeing Japanese destroyers pass close aboard and fire at point-blank range even as American sailors were abandoning the sinking destroyer, though accounts differ on the precise sequence of events in that final period. Evans himself was last seen alive at approximately 9:50, near the stern of Johnston, still aboard. He was urging men over the side. He was making sure the wounded were going first. He was doing, in other words, exactly what anyone who had known him since Annapolis would have predicted he would do. He was thinking about his men before he thought about himself. Several survivors reported seeing him in the water briefly after Johnston went down. None of them saw him again. Johnston sank at approximately 10:10 on the morning of October 25, 1944. She had been in continuous combat for approximately 3 hours. She had fired her entire ammunition load. She had expended all 10 of her torpedoes. She had, according to post-battle Japanese assessments, inflicted damage contributing to the destruction or disabling of multiple Japanese cruisers and had been directly responsible for disrupting Kurita's pursuit of the escort carriers during the critical early phase of the battle. The survivors in the water faced what the men of Samuel B. Roberts had also faced: the open Philippine Sea, no rescue ships, sharks, and the brutal mathematics of exposure. Johnston went down with approximately 186 of her crew. 141 men survived the sinking, but the ordeal in the water claimed more. When rescue finally came, American ships locating survivors in the days following the battle, the final count of men recovered alive from Johnston's crew was approximately 141, though the precise figures varied somewhat in different official reports depending on how subsequent deaths from wounds were categorized. The battle itself ended in a way that no one on either side entirely expected. At 9:11 in the morning, while Johnston was still fighting, while Roberts was burning and sinking, while Hull lay dead in the water and Heermann was still making gun runs, Vice Admiral Kurita ordered the center force to break off the engagement and retire north. His decision, transmitted in the precise language of Japanese naval signals, translated roughly to cease engagement, reform, withdraw. 23 warships turned away from 6 crippled escort carriers that were within gun range, unable to defend themselves, and pointed their bows north toward the San Bernardino Strait. The reasons for Kurita's decision have been debated by naval historians for 8 decades. He later said that he believed he had been fighting fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, not escort carriers and destroyer escorts, that the ferocity of the American response had convinced him he was engaged with a substantially larger and more powerful force than the one actually present. The torpedo attacks had damaged several of his cruisers severely. Continuous air attacks on the escort carrier aircraft, planes armed with whatever ordnance was available, in some cases making dry runs with empty bomb racks, simply to disrupt Japanese fire control, had further disrupted his formations. His communications were degraded. His staff's picture of the tactical situation was confused. And the destroyers that charged his battleships. That factor, perhaps more than any other, seems to have contributed to Kurita's fundamental misread of what he was facing. No doctrine, no intelligence assessment, no scenario in any Japanese naval wargame had prepared him for the possibility that a force this small would fight this hard. In the Japanese naval calculus, ships that were outmatched retreated or surrendered. Ships that faced impossible odds did not charge battleships. The American ships did not retreat. They charged. And Kurita, watching ship after small ship drive straight toward his fleet through fire and smoke and impossible odds, concluded that he must be wrong about what he was facing, because men who knew they were outmatched didn't fight like that. The irony that runs through the entire battle off Samar, the thread that connects Johnston's suicidal charge in Roberts' final torpedo run and Hull's last gun salvo in Heermann's run at Yamato, is precisely this. The Americans won not by being stronger, but by behaving as though strength was irrelevant. Evans had not decided to fight because he calculated that Johnston could defeat the center force. He had decided to fight because the mission required it, and because the men under his protection required it, and because there was, in the end, no other acceptable choice available to a man of his particular character. The math said to withdraw. Evans had never been much interested in the math. Gamber Bay was sunk by Japanese gunfire during the battle, the only American carrier lost to surface gunfire in the entire war. Hull was sunk, Johnston was sunk, Roberts was sunk, but the escort carrier survived. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf survived. MacArthur's ground forces continued their operations uninterrupted. The objective that Evans and his crew died protecting remained secure. Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation, written in the formal language that military commendations use to describe acts that formal language was never quite designed to capture, noted that Evans had courageously defied overwhelming odds, pressing home his attacks with reckless disregard for his ship's safety. It noted that he had inspired his crew to fight with exceptional valor against a vastly superior force. It noted that he had charged the enemy despite receiving mortal damage, and that his ship had fought until she could fight no more. The citation was presented to his family. Evans himself was never found. The Medal of Honor is the United States' highest military decoration for valor. Evans joined a small group of naval officers to receive it for surface combat in the Second World War. He joined an even smaller group, perhaps unique to him, who received it for charging a battleship with a destroyer on his own initiative, before being ordered to, because he looked at the situation and decided that was what needed to happen. 3 ships of the United States Navy have since borne the name USS Evans, each one a continuation of the tradition that Evans himself represented. The name Johnston has also been carried forward in American naval service. The destroyer escort that fought alongside Johnston, Samuel B. Roberts, was honored with her own successor, commissioned in 1986, which went on to strike a mine in the Persian Gulf in 1988 and survive, in a fitting continuation of the tradition of small ships absorbing punishment and refusing to sink. Victor Vescovo found Johnston in 2021 on the floor of the Philippine Sea, at 21,024 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered at the time of its location. The wreck lay in three main sections: the bow, the stern, and a large midships debris field. Her gun mounts were still visible. The torpedo tubes were identifiable. The nameplate, hull number 557, was captured on video by Vescovo's submersible. She had rested there for 77 years. Evans rested somewhere in the same area of ocean. No marker, no grave site that any map can show. Only the water and the darkness, and the ship he refused to abandon while there was still a man aboard who needed help getting over the side. The battle off Samar lasted approximately 3 hours from first contact to the last gun salvo. In those 3 hours, a collection of destroyers and destroyer escorts that had no reasonable chance of surviving the engagement, that every tactical analysis available to their commanders confirmed could not succeed against the force they faced, managed to protect 6 escort carriers, preserve the Leyte Gulf invasion fleet, and contribute decisively to withdrawal of the most powerful Japanese surface action group of the war. They did this at enormous cost. Hundreds of men died. Ships that had been commissioned only months before were sent to the bottom of the sea. Young men who had gone to sea to serve their country discovered, in the space of a morning, what it meant to be asked for everything and to give it. What Evans understood, in those seconds on the bridge when the radar contacts resolved into Japanese warships, and the scale of what was coming became clear, was something that cannot be taught in any Naval Academy classroom and cannot be drilled into a crew during any training exercise. He understood that there are moments when the only response available to a person of genuine character is the one that the math says is impossible. He understood that leadership sometimes means telling 327 men to follow you into a fight that no one expects to survive, not because survival is guaranteed, but because the alternative, the carriers sunk, the soldiers on the beach cut off, the years of sacrifice rendered meaningless, is simply not acceptable. He turned his ship toward the Japanese fleet at 7:10 in the morning on October 25, 1944. He never turned it back. Here is the expanded final section, approximately 600 additional words to append directly to the end of Part 2, replacing the closing paragraph and final CTA. Slot this in after, he never turned it back. There is a quality to the men who fought at Samar that resists the usual categories we apply to wartime heroism. We are accustomed, in the retelling of great battles, to finding heroes who charged because they did not fully understand the danger, or who advanced because orders left them no other option, or who fought on because the adrenaline of combat had temporarily suspended the survival instinct that governs ordinary human behavior. Evans fits none of those categories. He was not naive about what he was facing. He had read every action report from every destroyer engagement in the Pacific theater. He knew precisely what Japanese naval gunfire did to thin-hulled American ships. He had no orders requiring him to charge. He acted before Sprague's command was issued. And the sustained, methodical nature of Johnston's attack, lasting not seconds or minutes but hours, through multiple hits, through progressive loss of speed and firepower, through the deaths of his own crew members, argues against any explanation rooted in the temporary suspension of rational judgment. Evans charged because he chose to, fully informed, fully aware, in complete command of his faculties and his ship. He looked at 72,000 tons of Japanese steel bearing down on 6 unarmored carriers, and made a decision that the men aboard those carriers, and the soldiers on the beaches beyond them, were worth more than the mathematics of his own survival. That decision did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a man shaped by a particular history. The son of a Native American family in Oklahoma Territory, trained at an institution that had admitted him as one of a very small number of men of his background, forged in the early Pacific campaigns into a commander who had seen enough of war to understand its true costs and still believed, had to believe, or the whole enterprise of leadership becomes hollow, that the costs were sometimes worth bearing. Evans was not a man who talked much about what drove him. The historical record contains few speeches, few written reflections, few moments where he explained himself in the way that later historians might have wished. What the record contains instead is a pattern of behavior consistent across his entire career. When the situation required someone to go forward, Evans went forward. The men of Johnston went with him. All 327 of them. Not because they were ordered to. The order came later. They went because Evans had spent the months since Johnston's commissioning becoming the kind of officer whose crew would follow him into a fight that the regulations had never anticipated. That is the other story inside the Battle off Samar, running parallel to the tactical narrative of torpedo runs and gun duels and smoke screens. It is a story of what a ship becomes when its captain has convinced every man aboard that the ship's purpose is worth dying for, not through speeches, through example, through the daily, unglamorous labor of being present and prepared and honest about what the sea could do to them and what they were going to do anyway. Johnston was commissioned in October of 1943. She fought her last battle exactly 1 year later. In that year, Evans took a new ship and a crew that had not yet fired their guns in anger and turned them into something that the Japanese Imperial Navy, for all its experience and firepower and tactical sophistication, could not quite account for. He turned them into men who would charge a battleship. The Philippine Sea is very deep where Johnston rests, 21,000 feet. The pressure at that depth is approximately 9,000 pounds per square inch. Nothing decays quickly in water that cold and that dark. Johnston will lie there for centuries, mostly intact, her gun still trained in the direction she was firing when she went down. She is still facing the enemy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.